Greetings everyone, this is Jacob Fowles coming at you live from Upland, California. Today I'm going to be discussing the chapter that I read from our critical pedagogy book, and I've entitled my presentation Read Pedagogy, Rethinking Native American Academia. And I gave it this title because the chapter I read has a very strong emphasis on the contemporary issues that the Native American community faces. And so, without further ado, let's begin this presentation. And I've wrote this statement, that being perhaps one of the most misrepresented populations in America today is its own ancestors. And what I mean by own ancestors is the Native American population. And I started the presentation off with this because prior to reading the chapter in our book, this is an idea that I'd always kind of pondered. And after reading the chapter in our book, this idea or this thought that I'd always sort of had in the back of my head was really, it was one of the main things that this chapter tried to talk about and discuss. That being that, the Native American population faces a lot of contemporary oppression, even though not everyone really can see that. And so this is kind of a strong point, and this kind of gave me the willpower and it made me really it really made this chapter interesting for me. So before getting into the details of the chapter and talking about the author and things like that, I kind of want to quickly go over what critical pedagogy means. We've been learning a lot about critical pedagogy and the concept of it throughout the semester, but sometimes given the madness that one might face in school, it's a unique topic that not all of us grew up being aware of, and so it'd be nice to kind of just not redefine, but just look over what critical pedagogy means real quick. And the first quote I have is that schools are inherently biased and perpetuate social imbalances of power. And so I'm planning on teaching history, and this quote right here really communicates a lot, because when you're studying history, one of the main things you would hope to accomplish or practice is learning how to look at an event from different perspectives. And so to see that part of what critical pedagogy is stating that part of what scholars are stating that they recognize when they're talking about critical pedagogy is that a lot of what we learn in school has some tone of bias to it, and that there are a lot more social imbalances of power in school than I think what most people either realize or fail to do anything about. And so, that being said, in order to get at the heart of critical pedagogy, you want to be able to develop this sort of critical consciousness, and that being that you're aware of these, that you become aware of these imbalances, that they're in front of you, and you have the choice of doing something or not about it. And so when you're in a classroom like this, in order to practice critical pedagogy, you essentially just need to be consciously aware of your surroundings and what you're being taught and what society kind of teaches you, and you need to eradicate essentially any of these social imbalances if you can, and pursue social justice instead. And so that's sort of the main scoop on what critical pedagogy means to me. So I want to go into this question of, now that we're talking, we're going to get into what my chapter was sort of about, and how the themes in this chapter relate to critical pedagogy and relate to to my subject, which is history. And I want to ask you, how is your own culture represented in history books? And I've listed these kind of pictures right here. We have, and they're all from the civil rights era in U.S. history, and that's just one aspect of how cultures and different ethnicities are portrayed in history books. But I want you to think about how you identify your own self and how your identity is represented in the books that we read when we're sitting in class, or when you were sitting in history class in high school. Was it a lot? Do you feel like you were represented a lot, like you were represented a little? Do you feel like what you read about, your cultural heritage was represented fairly? Could there have been more said? And so this is a really important question to ask, because once we start talking, when it comes to Native Americans, you'll find that they're represented very little. And I want you to think about your own culture, and see if you can make any sort of if you can relate to what we'll talk about when it comes to Native Americans at all. And so depending on, and like I said, like I was just saying, depending on sort of how you feel about how your culture was, or your cultural heritage is represented in the history books that we have in class, how does that affect how you identify yourself as a person even today? So history is all about learning about the past and how things came to be, cause and effect, things like that. And so based off of what you've learned about your own history, how does that affect how you identify yourself today? Does it affect how you identify yourself in any way? And that's another important question to ask. Moving on to Native Americans, you'll find, and I mean, I'm even thinking now, the only things that come to mind when I think about learning about Native Americans in history is the Trail of Tears and the Native American boarding schools. And I've kind of placed pictures of both of those episodes in history on this slide. And not to say that it's not important to learn about these things when it comes to Native Americans, but it's not only is it important it's important to learn about these things about Native Americans, but you have to realize that, what else can you think of when it comes to Native American history that you really know about? And so that brings up these questions that not only have I asked myself, but I think you should ask yourself. And it's, what do I really know about Native Americans? Do history books tell me, do they give you sufficient information on that population? And then any of your understandings, anything you know to be true and as factual about Native Americans, are you being culturally sensitive? I mean, how do you know if you're being culturally sensitive towards their history? And then lastly, are you being biased at all? When you learn about Native Americans and sort of their relationships that they had with other people, and mostly, European descending peoples and populations, how much of the Native American perspective is coming out in what you read? And you have to kind of think about that, because a lot of what you do learn in history books is coming from one side. And that's what we're really trying to get at here, is that Native Americans are totally misrepresented. And so here I have, her name is Sandy Grande. I hope it's pronounced Grande, because that will be really embarrassing if it's not. This is the author of the chapter in the Critical Pedagogy book that I read. And the chapter that I read was entitled American Indian Geographies of Identity and Power. And really the main message that Sandy was trying to get across in her chapter is that there's a need for the Native American population to develop a contemporary identity, a modern identity that they feel comfortable with. Because for the longest time, I mean, even until right now, the Native American population is constantly pressured and under oppression, even today, by sort of the so-called capitalist, capitalist America. And she also states that people really need to become aware of this situation that Native Americans are facing, because without having this awareness of the oppression that Native Americans still face today, there's no way that they can possibly develop an identity where they feel comfortable and they feel like people share a certain sensitivity towards their history and towards their people and towards their population. And this is really kind of a concept that if you apply it to really any other ethnical population, it rings true. And you see this in the civil rights movements. That's why I put those pictures up. When it comes to the Hispanic population, for example, it's important that people are aware of the situation that people are in, and if they're being oppressed, people need to be aware of that, so that this community can progress, move forward, and develop an identity that they feel comfortable with and that fits into society. And so that's sort of the idea that Sandy is really trying to communicate in her chapter that I read. And through reading her chapter, I learned about this phenomenal scholar, Vine Deloria Jr. And I'm not going to talk too much about him, but what I do want to say is I did some research on him, and his life work, he passed away in 2005, his life works really kind of capture altogether what Sandy was trying to somewhat communicate in her piece that I read. If you just quickly read these quotes down here, you'll really find that Vine Deloria Jr. was a huge advocate for the Native American community, and that he really wanted people to become aware of the situation that so many people are blind to. And we'll get into this concept of being blind to the Native American community in just a second. So, going back to this whole thing with identity that Sandy was talking about, it's the lack of a modern Native American identity makes for a vicious cycle where cultural biases remain at the forefront of common knowledge. And this means that without Native Americans being able to come out and stand strong and create this contemporary identity where not only they feel comfortable but they fit into the scope of America in today, without them being able to do something like that, all these cultural biases, all these things we think we know about Native Americans that aren't really true, may not necessarily be true, given the biases, that remains common knowledge. That remains what we think we know about Native Americans, or what we're being told is Native American history. And so this, and by letting these cultural biases remain at the forefront of our own common knowledge, our own understanding of Native Americans, they in essence remain like an invisible population, something we don't think about. And think about that for a second, because how often do you read about anything in the news, anything online, where anything about the Native American civil rights movement? You hear about all these other civil rights movements, African American, Hispanic, and not to downplay those in any sense, but think about how downplayed the Native Americans are played in history. And that's what I'm really trying to get at in this slideshow. And this is kind of just going off of what I was just saying. And this is Sandy saying that, you know, how can one create a comfortable identity for themselves when they're still being oppressed? And these are 3 points. I don't think I'll have time to go over them all in detail, but identity appropriation, cultural encroachment, and corporate commodification are 3 things that Sandy really points out in her chapter as evidence that Native Americans are still being oppressed even today. And no one knows about it, no one thinks about it. And so we lack awareness, and by lacking awareness, we maintain these biased views and these insensitive views of Native Americans. And you know, these are some of them right here, right now. These cultural insensitivities and bias we have about Native Americans. And I think everyone can kind of relate to, or knows something about all 4 of these pictures, can relate to them in some way. And that's our understanding of Native Americans, essentially, in a lot of ways. And you know, you have the Cleveland Indian logo. You have Sacagawea and Lewis and Clark down on the bottom left, Pocahontas. And then, of course, you have the classic Coachella goers who wear these Indian headsets but don't really know anything about Native Americans. And it's really sad, and that's what I'm trying to get at. And when it comes to critical pedagogy, we really need to be aware and sensitive to our own disunderstandings, which I know isn't a word, but you know, we need to be aware that we don't understand a lot about the Native American community. And so I want to get into, you know, we've been talking about how Native Americans need to identify themselves in modern times because they're still being oppressed, and that's because of our own lack of understanding about them. And in order to sort of relate this chapter and relate this theme to critical pedagogy and my own subject being history, we need to figure out what we're going to do about our own, you know, insensitivities towards the Native American population. And so I listed 3 things that I could think of in terms of what we can do, and one being we need to realize, and that was one thing I said, you know, on the critical pedagogy slide, we need to realize that we have an insensitivity towards the Native American population, and we need to realize that that did exist in the past and that it still does exist today. We have this insensitivity towards them. And so developing a realization of this is the first big step in being able to do anything about it. Is just being aware. And then the second one, when it comes to Native American identity, we need to realize that there's this definition of Native American identity from the Western point of view, which would be, you know, white America. And then there's also, you know, another perspective of what Native American identity means, and that comes from the traditional tribes themselves. And then the last one I put was we need to have higher standards in school and in our classrooms through scholarly sources. And I learned a ton about Native American identity and how important it is to bring their situation to awareness, you know, to widespread awareness in America. But the fact that I had to research through scholarly databases to even get any information on the situation that Native Americans face today is kind of pathetic. I mean, students in school should be reading primary sources about Native Americans that actually mean something and that have something to do with, you know, say Sandy Grande's article, or Vine Deloria Jr. I mean, these things need to be a little more public than they are, because I'm in grad school right now doing all this research, and it's hard for me to even find anything on this topic or on this subject that goes into as much depth. So if we want to build this awareness, we need to make these types of sources available to kids that are in high school. And my last slide is a link to a really cool lesson that I found on that has to do with critical pedagogy, and it's a way of kind of helping people become more aware of the situation that Indians faced then and face now. And this is something I could do in a history class, and so I thought it was really cool. I won't go over everything, but it's essentially a civil rights activity on Native Americans. And I know I never learned about the civil rights movement for Native Americans in high school. I know I learned about, Hispanic civil rights and African American civil rights and Asian American civil rights, but I never once learned anything about Native Americans. So this is just something that I found that's really cool, and I think it promotes this concept of critical pedagogy. And so, that being said, I mean, it's one thing I could see myself kind of going over in my own classroom in the future, and it's just one thing that's out there where we can really start advocating for critical pedagogy, and we could start advocating for this awareness for the Native American population. And so that's the end of my show.